to plant tomatoes. I love homegrown garden tomatoes. I love them a lot. And so every summer that there has been an opportunity to plant a garden, I have done that. Right now, my garden is actually just flower beds that get good sunlight. So everybody that drives by our house sees my tomatoes growing. Last year, I actually had some people start calling me the tomato tree lady because my tomato plants were so tall. And I've gotten more than a few questions on how I grow my tomatoes. Hi, I'm Amy on A Lolly Life. And I guess occasionally I am the tomato tree lady. I'm doing 2 videos on how to grow tomatoes. One of them is about planting the tomatoes, and another one will be coming along on how to care for and tend the tomatoes. I buy my tomatoes from the local home improvement store. Tomatoes aren't necessarily easy to grow from seeds, and you have to start them months before it is planting season outside. But whether you have started and nurtured your tomatoes from seeds, or you pick up a 6-pack from the local garden center, at some point you need to plant your tomatoes outside. The first question is, where are you going to plant your tomatoes? And a place that has several hours of morning sunlight is really ideal, but I've had tomatoes really thrive with only afternoon sunlight or only evening sunlight. But you do need to pick a place that gets multiple hours of sunlight every day. You can easily plant a tomato in one of your flower beds. That is a really good place to plant a tomato. So if you don't want to put forth all the effort to put out a full-blown garden, then your flower beds is a pretty good option. In different areas of the country or the world, you have to do different things to take care of your tomatoes. When we lived in Texas, it was so hot that I had to put up a sunshade that blocked 50% of the sunlight because the sun was so hot that it would burn the tomato plants. I know someone in Texas that does 2 gardens, one in the spring and one in the fall, and they don't even bother with the super hot direct sunlight in the summer. In areas where it's cooler and you have a much shorter growing season, you want a spot that gets as much as much sunlight as possible during the day. And something that is closer to the house, that the house might protect it a little bit from wind or rain or hail or maybe a light early or late frost. So after you've picked your garden patch spot, you will need a few things. I buy a large bag of peat moss when I'm planting tomatoes. Peat moss holds more water in the soil, and so your tomatoes will manage hot, dry days better. It helps keep the weeds down and makes up for the fact that the soil you're planting it in probably isn't top-notch. You need to dig a hole that's about 1 foot deep, or at least as deep as the plant that you're planting, and probably equally as wide. The reason that you do this is because it is important to break up the soil down there. It just makes it easier for the roots to take hold and the plant to take off just a little bit faster. Now you're going to channel your inner child and pretend you are making soup with the dirt that you dug up. I added a generous dose of peat moss. I usually go for a 50-50 mix, and you just mix it up with your hands and start to break up as many of the clods of dirt and make it just a really nice blend of soil. I also use some tomato food, and if you have some eggshells that you can crush up and put that in there, or maybe some powdered milk, you can mix that up into there because the calcium in the eggshells or the powdered milk will help with blossom end rot. You need to mix and mix your dirt soup for several minutes, breaking up the clumps. When you take the tomato out of the container, if it's root bound, then you need to loosen up the roots and just kind of gently break them apart a little bit. Root bound basically means that there are more roots showing than dirt. You might think that a tomato plant like these that are kind of leggy with really long stems are not very good, but we'll just bury it deep and bury it all the way up to where the plant is, and this will all turn into root. When you plant tomatoes, you bury the plant deep. You only want about 1/4 of the plant actually showing above ground. The rest of the plant, anything that you plant and it ends up below ground, will root out, and it will give it a better root system. Obviously, too much of a good thing is not a good thing, and so you do want a few inches of tomato above the ground. The other reason you want to bury your tomatoes deep is because tomatoes can be a little bit wimpy when you first plant them outside. Most people, if they're growing them from seed, they will will take them outside for a few hours every day for a week or so to harden up the tomato plants or hardy them up. I don't know what the right word is. Anyway, they do that so that the tomatoes are just kind of get acclimated to the weather outside. If you plant your tomatoes deep, then you can plant them outside just a little bit sooner without having to worry so much about a late frost, and you can put a little tiny greenhouse on them. We'll talk more about tiny little greenhouses for your tomato plants in a minute, but first, let's finish planting our tomato. Press the dirt down firmly with your hands around the tomato. While you're doing this, you should make a circle mound of dirt around the plant. That helps with watering. After I have the tomato planted and the soil is packed down firmly and I have a nice little ring around the tomato, then I put a nice layer of peat moss. The peat moss keeps the weeds down and holds the water in the ground. Now let's protect our tender little tomato from frost or the sun or bunnies or people's feet with a milk jug. A gallon milk jug that is clear or frosted works best. You want to cut off the bottom of the milk jug and remove the cap on top for ventilation. You don't have to do this milk jug hoodus greenhouse thing, but it does help and you can start your plants outside a little bit sooner. I put the tomato cages on immediately because it helps protect the plant a little bit more from things like feet or the plant being nibbled on or cats using the freshly turned up dirt as a restroom. I prefer square tomato cages for several reasons. First, you can stack them, so when your tomato outgrows the cage, you can add a second one on top. Tomatoes, even with a little tender care, will outgrow their tomato cage. Number two, square tomato cages are sturdier and less likely to tip over. I think that the sturdy square cages have a lot to do with why my tomato plants grow so tall. Because they're supported, the tomato is able to focus more on growing and less on keeping itself upright. My square tomato cages were purchased more than a dozen years ago. I have included a link for tomato cages that have the same design, so they fold flat for storage. It's 10 gauge steel wire, same as mine. Mine are 48 inches tall and these are 30 inches tall, but they have the same size around the 8-inch opening. I paid about $50 a pair, so these are a little less expensive, but they're also not quite as tall as mine. Before you're finished planting your tomatoes, you need to water it. It is better to water a tomato with a little bit over a long period of time than a whole lot of water over a short period of time. This is when I usually get my hose set up so that it's easy for me to water the tomatoes, because you do have to water tomatoes. Tomatoes require a lot of water. You can't get away with not watering tomatoes. Don't forget that you are more important than fresh garden tomatoes. And that means you're pretty important because I really love fresh garden tomatoes. I love you. Eat some extra vegetables and smile a lot. I'll see you on the next episode of A Lolly Life.